The sentence struck the air like a blade drawn across silk. "You will never be my true wife." It was not shouted, not even spoken with passion. It was delivered with the precise, merciless calm of a man who had rehearsed cruelty until it sounded like fact. The chamber fell silent around the words. Servants, holding their breath outside the door, repeated them before the echo had died, and by dusk the entire house knew that the new Marchioness had entered Blackwood not as a bride, but as a tolerated stranger. Diana stood beneath the weight of the decree and did not flinch. Her face remained composed, but beneath the quiet her heart raced with the realization that her life had been written into a tragedy before the ink of her vows had dried. She had entered this marriage as a duty, to preserve her family's name, to provide shelter for her ailing mother, to settle debts her father's misfortunes had carved into their estate. She had not expected affection, she had not even asked for kindness, but this cold rejection, spoken at the threshold of her new existence, was a wound no dowry could salve. The Marquis's eyes did not waver. They were hard and distant, like shutters drawn against a storm. He dismissed her with a gesture, as if she were an intruder in her own home. The door closed between them, and in that sound she heard the map of her future. Rooms divided by silence, meals measured by protocol, days strung together not by tenderness, but by endurance. It might have broken another woman, one who measured her worth by the warmth of a husband's gaze. But Diana had been tempered in hardship long before this night. She had nursed her mother through winters when the hearth was low, held her father's trembling hand as he confessed losses at the card table, borne the humiliation of creditors arriving like vultures to strip the family's pride. She had learned, long before stepping into Blackwood, that dignity could be sustained even when affection could not. Still, the cruelty of his words lingered. Alone in her chamber, she unpinned her veil and folded it carefully, her fingers steady, though her eyes burned. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, an image of composure wrapped in lace, and whispered to herself that survival was an art she had already mastered. If she could endure a loveless marriage, she could endure anything. Yet even as she whispered it, the wound throbbed, not because she had been denied love, but because she had been denied the chance to prove herself worthy of it. The house itself seemed to conspire with his decree. Blackwood Manor was vast and severe, its corridors long enough to swallow footsteps, its portraits watching from the walls with disdain for intrusion. It was not a home but a fortress, built on stone and silence. Servants moved quietly, as though fearing to disturb the air. Every sound Diana made felt like a trespass, and yet, as she walked its halls in the days that followed, she sensed something beneath the surface, a hollowness in the grandeur, an emptiness that spoke not only of wealth, but of wounds. She began to ask questions, softly, to the older maids and the steward who had served through generations. Their answers came reluctantly, as though loyalty to the family required silence even when the family had long ceased to care. She learned fragments of the Marquis's childhood spent under the shadow of a stern father and a beloved mother whose death had left the house colder than winter. She heard the name Catherine whispered once in the servants' hall, spoken with the reverence reserved for ghosts. She understood then that his decree had not been born of her own unworthiness, but of a grief so deep it had become a cage. Yet knowing did not lessen the cruelty of her situation. Each morning she was reminded of her role, not as wife in truth, but as figurehead, a woman placed to fulfill obligation. At meals, he spoke to her of estate accounts with the same tone he might use to instruct a steward. At gatherings, he presented her formally, never once allowing his gaze to linger with warmth. When she attempted conversation, he responded with politeness so precise it cut like glass. And yet, beneath the surface of his indifference, Diana sensed the tremor of a man haunted by shadows he dared not name. It was in these early days that Diana made her choice. She could succumb to the bitterness his words invited, wither into the silence he demanded, and allow herself to become as cold and lifeless as the manor that housed her. Or she could fight, not for his love, which he had denied her, but for her own dignity, her own purpose, her own quiet claim to existence within these walls. She chose the latter. When she walked into the servants' quarters to thank a maid by name for her diligence, gasps followed her footsteps. No mistress had spoken thus in years. When she ordered repairs for a tenant's cottage roof, using funds she coaxed from overlooked corners of the estate accounts, whispers spread that the new Marchioness was not content to be ornamental. And when she stood alone in the neglected rose garden, thorns heavy, beds overrun with weeds, she felt a stirring within herself, a recognition that beauty abandoned could be beauty restored. But all of this came later. For now, in the shadow of his words, she lay awake in her chamber, listening to the echo of his decree. "You will never be my true wife." Each repetition was a blade, but each blade sharpened her resolve. If she could not be his wife in love, she would be his wife in strength. If he would not see her as partner, she would make herself indispensable in ways he could not deny. She did not yet know how. She only knew that her story had not ended with his sentence. What neither of them realized in those first cruel hours was that the sentence meant to banish her had also planted the seed of defiance that would change everything. For words once spoken cannot be recalled. They linger, they burn, they create the very opposite of what they declare. And in telling her she would never be his true wife, the Marquis had unknowingly set her on the path to becoming not only his true wife, but his salvation. The night deepened. Candles guttered. The manor creaked with the weight of centuries. Diana sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, her heart aching but unbroken. She whispered once more to the silence, "I will endure." And the silence, though it did not answer, seemed to shift ever so slightly, as if acknowledging that endurance, once chosen, is a kind of power no decree can undo. She was born into a house that prized gentility even when the roof leaked in winter and the wheat came up thin. The Russell nursery taught lace-making fingers and piano scales before it taught the feel of coin or the sound of a ledger closing. Tutors praised her French accent and her needlework, but the lessons that would shape her outlasted grammar and crochets. How to keep a straight back when shame knocked at the front door. How to thank the baker on credit as if paying him were a simple delay of horses. How to fold a letter so that the words of worry stayed folded too. If the Russell name had once been a velvet cloak, by the time she reached 16, it was a careful patchwork, stitched by a daughter who understood that some silences are a kind of loyalty. Her father had not always been a ruin. As a little girl, she adored the way he lifted her onto a chestnut mare, the way his laugh filled the stable rafters, warm hay floating in the beam of morning. When the markets were kind and luck rode his shoulder, he danced her mother across the ballroom and tossed gold to the fiddlers. But luck is a guest with sharp eyes and quick feet. He learned to chase it at gaming tables where oil lamps made shadows of the honest. One loss became a habit, and a habit became a season, and by the time his daughter could twist her hair into a chignon without a maid's mirror, there were pawnbroker tickets hidden behind the family christening cup. She learned to count the days between his good mood and his next pledge. A silver snuffer extinguished, a sideboard missing 2 spoons, a mare sold to pay for a night he could not remember. Her mother made illness look like devotion, disguising her weakness as piety, covering a cough with a hymn. On the days when breath came hard, the bed became a chapel, and the daughter the nurse, ladling broth and brightening curtains as if sunlight could be poured from a jug. There were evenings when the girl's hands smelled of lavender water and vinegar and the rag of a cooling cloth, when she fell asleep sitting upright on a chair, because lying down would have admitted there was no one else to turn the hourglass. The maid, Martha, found her that way more than once, and learned that the Russell daughter would accept help without complaint and return it without ceremony. Martha taught her the practical arts the governesses neglected: how to look at a receipt and know what the house truly consumed, where to tap a cask to hear whether it lied, how to praise a cook for frugality without making it an insult. If the house remained upright, it was because 2 women learned to brace it with competence that society could not see. When she turned 18, she inherited a map of her father's debts and a new habit of walking the estate at dawn, dressing warm, skirt pinned to stride over wet furrows. Tenants spoke more freely to a lady who stepped into their mud. She learned names, not just holdings. Mrs. Penfold's boy with the twisted foot who needed a cobbler, Elias the thatcher who drank more in April because of a memory he refused to share. She paid them in attention when she could not pay them in coin, and in return they gave her the kindest currency. News that could have come to her as complaint, but arrived instead as warning. The north fence was weak. The miller's wife had a fever. A clever woman in the village might be persuaded to take in her mother as a companion for a fortnight to give the house time to breathe. She filed these under her ribs like pages in a ledger, but a ledger must balance, and the accident came like a sum that could not be borne forward. A horse thrown, a hedge-post not seen, a blow to the skull that ended more than an afternoon ride. In the quiet after the funeral, the household did not so much mourn as stop moving. The clocks seemed louder. The portraits on the staircase looked down with a new, severe familiarity. We are what remains when the coins are counted. The solicitor did not need to tell her what she already knew. To save the land on which her mother's breath lengthened more easily, to keep the people who made the house a home from dispersing like chaff, something more than thrift would be required. She had already pawned the necklace her grandmother wore on her own betrothal day. There were few things left to sell that were not flesh or name. So she practiced the only courage society permitted her, the willingness to be bartered. It was a skill with its own etiquette. She learned to sit at a desk, back straight, listening to 2 men speak around her as if she were a parcel to be insured, and to interject at the single moment when her voice could move a clause in her mother's favour. She insisted on a small annuity and on the settlement of the most pressing tenant arrears under the heading of improvements, and the men, surprised to find the parcel articulate, yielded in increments. When she stepped into the carriage for London, she knew she was stepping into a life that demanded more patience than dreams. She had already started to rehearse the sentence she might someday be forced to hear: "You will never be my true wife." She gathered her dignity like a cloak, knowing a cloak's worth is not to disguise the wearer, but to keep her warm while walking through wind. Across the county and across years, another child stood in another nursery and learned a different liturgy. He was born to a house where the doors never squeaked, where floors glowed with beeswax, and forests of portraits instructed every visitor on how power looks when it is inherited. He loved two things first: the smell of fresh earth in the garden, and the way his mother's hand found the crown of his head, as if blessing were a habit with her. The garden was hers, a geometry of paths and petals, a scholar's patience in bloom. She made him notice the differences in whites, the cream of one rose, the chalk of another, the barely blush at the heart of a third, as if attention could be a kind of prayer. He learned to weed, to loosen soil around tender roots, to water in a circle so as not to drown. That is how he learned to be gentle. He learned other lessons with a stricter hand. His father had an affection for rules that was nearly physical. When the boy looked at him, he felt the weight of the man's disappointment, as if it could be entered in a ledger and calculated with interest. "You are what you must be, and you will be what I was," the voice said without needing to be spoken. At dinners, he was corrected not for slouching, but for joy. Too much laughter was a draught that must be shut. Still, while his mother lived, the house warmed. People spoke of the Marquis's kindness as a contagion that spread down the staircase to the hall and out the side door to the sculleries, where the cook said her name without glancing over their shoulders. The boy grew as boys do, in the exact shape of the attention he received. His mother's gaze made him thoughtful. His father's made him precise. Illness entered the house like a winter that would not leave. His mother turned her face to the pillow and tried to breathe the way she had taught him to breathe among the roses, slow, with patience. He sat beside the bed and counted not heartbeats, but remedies, herbs steeped, the physician's visits, his own offerings of childlike magic, the smoothness of a stone from the garden, the clean smell of a new page in a book. The day she died, the house seemed to constrict rather than collapse. His father's grief did not cry or break. It hardened. It found a target. "A fever you survived took her from me," the man said with his jaw, if not his tongue. The boy heard it. The boy believed it. That misplaced guilt was the first brick in a wall he would spend a decade raising. It began with small cruelties disguised as traditions. The garden was closed, not uprooted. His father was too proud to be seen ordering destruction, but neglected on command. Gardeners were reassigned. The paths went to nettle. The boy was sent to a school his father praised as bracing. It was far from London, far from any road he knew, surrounded by moors that taught the landscape of loneliness. There were masters whose patience was measured in punishments. He did well, because precision is a form of armor, and excellence a shield. He learned Latin declensions with a vengeance, and Greek as if it could reverse time. And when he slept, he dreamed of damp wool and the absence of her voice. Letters from home were infrequent and brief. When they came, they bore his father's handwriting, which looked like iron rails laid down a page. On the holidays, he returned to a house that spoke a new language. A cousin reigned there with a smile too well rehearsed to be called warm. She filled the empty space his mother had left with competence and with claims. If grief had made the house colder, her presence made it cordial in the way a shop window is cordial, all gleam and arrangement. She brought her daughter with her, a quiet child whose eyes told him what his own hands could not. There are rooms where children are taught to make less sound than the clock. He bore the cousin as one bears a draught, with tightened muscles and fewer hours spent near the door. Once, after the cousin cooed over the boy's good fortune in his fine education, he went to the garden and pressed his fingers into the soil as if it could admit him into another life. The earth under his nails was the first honest thing he had felt in months. He grew into a young man under the rule of two ambitions that did not look like ambitions. One was the vow never to need what could be taken away: love, softness, leisure. The other was the devotion to competence. He read ledgers for pleasure. He discovered he could turn numbers into fields with fewer stones, into cottages without leaks, into ships that carried goods to harbours whose names sounded like silk. He travelled and found that being away was a way of being safe. London gave him the noise he needed to drown out the house's silence. He cultivated a reputation for severity that did the work of a wall. It kept out the pitying, the curious, the greedy, and the kind. Especially the kind. In his 20s, he met a chance that did not look like a transaction. The daughter of a merchant sat down at a pianoforte and turned a small parlour into a bright room. He did not fall in love the way novels instruct. No thunderclap, no instant vow. He recognized something he had not permitted himself to recognize: the difference between a body that occupied a chair and a presence that made a chair seem lucky to hold it. They spoke about unimportant things and discovered that their unimportant things were the same: a garden without pretense, a book read aloud when the rain falls, the pleasure of a street where no one knows your name. He discovered to his astonishment that competence could also be tenderness, that there was a vocabulary of attention he had not exhausted. When illness took her, the mathematics of loss did not resolve to zero, it resolved to ash. For a time he permitted nothing to touch him. The city offered easy remedies: work without sleep, company without intimacy, the consolation of being consulted but not known. He accepted all of them and grew thinner in the kind of way that a tailor cannot mend. Duty drew him back to the house only when the old title crossed the hall to find him draped in mourning and power. He accepted it the way he accepted winter, because it arrived. He looked at the rose beds and did not step through the gate. He closed doors. He made the accounts perfect because perfection felt like a kindness to people he did not yet know how to love. The cousin objected in 100 polite ways. He outlasted them with 100 colder ones. He told himself this was strength. He told himself many things he did not believe. The boy in the garden and the girl counting spoons did not know one another, and did not need to, for their lives to prepare them for the same test. She learned to live where love took the form of duty, and duty did not complain. He learned to live where love took the form of absence, and absence did not apologize. If a stranger had asked them, on the edge of their choices, what they expected from marriage, they would have answered faithfully and tragically. She would have spoken of responsibility and the safety of others, of her mother needing less worry and her tenants needing more bread. He would have spoken of legacy and heirs, of the quiet dividends of decorum. Neither would have mentioned tenderness, because tenderness cannot be negotiated in advance. It is discovered the way water is discovered by the thirsty, as a gift, late, undeniable. What formed her, beyond the necessities, was the habit of beauty without extravagance. She found lilacs in farm hedges finer than bouquets on town sideboards. She bought a packet of seeds instead of a ribbon, and tucked it into the kitchen maid's hand with a conspirator's glance. She learned the names of colours that exist between white and ivory, because linens must sometimes be mended with thread not quite the same. She mended people, too, by treating their pride as carefully as their rough hands. It is a discipline to thank a man for his patience when what you owe him is money. She practiced it until the practice turned into a kind of affection. People looked back at her and saw their best selves reflected for a breath. It made them want to do right by her, which is the rarest economy. What formed him, beyond grief and rigour, was the memory of a bench under an arbour where a woman who loved white roses believed that contrast made purity brighter. He discovered this principle at tables far from any flower, that restraint is not absence but emphasis, that when you remove what is unnecessary, what remains becomes luminous. He believed he had done that to his own heart, removed the needy parts, the tender parts, and left something clear and useful. He did not recognize how much of what he had removed had been the light itself. In their separate houses, they practiced the future without knowing it. She rehearsed the conversation in which she would accept terms she did not choose, while quietly adding her own. She prepared not just her trousseau, but her conscience. She would not lie about her motives, even to herself. If she entered a bargain, she would do it awake. He rehearsed the conversation in which he would make terms that ensured safety for all parties, including the party he thought most endangered, himself. He imagined a wife who would perform the offices of her rank without pressing claims upon his time or soul. He imagined that this would be kindness. He did not imagine the cruelty of a sentence he would one day speak as if stating the weather. If childhood is an apprenticeship in the tools we carry, then hers were steadiness and the soft force of competence. His were reserve and the hard shield of control. What neither knew, and would only learn by breaking, was how the other's tools could complement theirs. Her steadiness teaching his control the shape of mercy, his reserve teaching her competence where to rest. She arrived at the threshold of his house, prepared to be honourable in a loveless life. He stood on the other side, prepared to be lawful in a scentless world. The life that had formed them had made them almost ready for each other. Almost. The last preparation would be a crisis neither of them would choose, and a garden both of them had already loved without knowing the other's name. Before that last, harsh schooling, something gentle worked on them both. It is the humiliating mercy of time that it writes its lessons on us whether we enroll or not. She found that when she spoke to the youngest housemaid, she heard Martha's voice and tempered her expectations to the hour and the exhaustion in it. He found that when he dictated a letter to a steward, a sentence softened itself before it reached paper. If asked, he would have said it was efficiency. Cutting words saves ink. But the steward noticed that he left room now for people to answer rather than only obey. She noticed that her certainty could be a kind of pride if it forgot to listen to someone else's fear. He noticed that his severity could become laziness if it saved him from the work of gentleness. She packed her trunk with practical things: thread, vinegar, a soft pair of slippers, because marble leaches heat from a foot, the way grief leaches warmth from a house. She tucked a book of poems beneath her chemises, not because she was sentimental, but because certain lines taught her the economy of feeling. A few words can carry an acre. He straightened his study and told himself his motives were unimpeachable. He repeated a sentence he had crafted, making it exact, because exactness had always protected him. He did not hear how the line sounded in the ear of a person who had already sacrificed to stand in that room. Both of them had learned to stand very still while someone else spoke, and to move only when the speaking ended. This made them seem well suited in the eyes of the world. It also made their first weeks married into a kind of tableau. A man behind a desk, a woman learning the shape of a house from its echo. But all of this belongs already to the future. The making of them happened earlier, in smaller rooms and longer winters. He grew into a man who could not pass a closed door without remembering the one he locked against the garden. She grew into a woman who could not pass a slumped shoulder without planning a way to lighten it. He believed that weakness announced itself and should be corrected. She believed that weakness often disguised itself as silence and should be understood. He had been formed to think that love was a debt that brought ruin. She had been formed to think that love was a responsibility that brought purpose. These convictions would clash, but they would also, in the strangest way, save them. There is a detail children store that adults forget until it returns in a different key. Hers was the weight of her mother's brooch. Nothing special to anyone else, but it warmed under her dress as if loyalty could find a temperature. His was the curve of the arbor over the bench, a shape that made shade act like shelter rather than scolding. Years later, when she pinned the brooch over a tremor in her chest and walked down an aisle no one dared call romantic, she felt the old warmth and found it steadied her. When he stepped into his study to greet a wife he did not intend to welcome, his eyes snagged on the shadow the window cast upon the carpet, and without knowing why he remembered a curve and a shade and the feeling of being held without being trapped. He dismissed it. The next time it would not be so easy. What they had both learned as children was this: that you can survive love's absence by making yourself useful. It is an honorable survival. It builds houses and keeps accounts and visits sick tenants and employs men who would otherwise be idle. It makes gates swing smoothly on oiled hinges. It does not, however, repair a heart. For that, something else must intervene, something that looks like risk and sounds like a name spoken for the first time without the armor of title. Their apprenticeships had prepared them to be excellent stewards of other people's well-being. To become husband and wife in truth would require them to become stewards of each other's wounds. Even the best apprenticeships do not teach that. It is learned only in the doing. By the time she sat in the carriage that rattled toward his house, she had finished the last line of the letter to her mother and blotted it carefully, so her mother would see no blurs where tears had fallen. She folded it with hands that had spent a decade unfolding worries and smoothing them flat. She could feel in herself not only fear, but the stubborn core that had kept a household from swallowing its own sorrow. She would carry that into rooms where her usefulness would be considered ornament. She would find a way to smuggle usefulness into beauty the way gardeners smuggle compost under roses. By the time he heard the announcement of her arrival, he had checked the clause about separate apartments 3 times for clarity. He told himself this was courtesy. He would not mislead her. He did not ask whether truth, spoken without kindness, can sometimes be a form of cruelty. That, too, would be taught to him, and swiftly. In the slow-breathing hours before dawn, the house staff in both places whispered about the same thing without knowing it. Whether the lives of their betters would be better for the joining, or merely larger. The old butler in his house polished the handle of the study door and hoped for a peace no wages could buy. The maid in hers fastened the last ribbon on a modest hat and prayed out loud in a kitchen that smelled of yeast. Not for romance, not for miracles, but for mercy. This is what it means to say childhood and formation, a sequence of rooms where the lessons are small and the consequences immediate, a decade of gestures that look like nothing and add up to a person who can stand upright when the wind picks up. She became the kind of woman who, when told that honor required sacrifice, did not confuse sacrifice with erasure. He became the kind of man who, when told that security required distance, did not confuse distance with strength. They were almost ready. The last lessons would not be delivered by tutors or fathers or cousins or stewards. They would be delivered by a fever and by a garden and by the scene neither of them rehearsed, a night when one of them would refuse to leave the other to suffer alone, and in that refusal discover that the truest formation had been toward courage neither of them had named. When the carriage wheels left the mud of her childhood estate and climbed the gravelled path of Blackwood Manor, Diana crossed not only miles, but a threshold into a life she had rehearsed only in resolve. She entered as a bride in name, knowing her vows were currency, not devotion. Yet with every corridor she walked, every portrait staring down with centuries of judgment, she was already beginning the long ascent of her own transformation. The rise was not sudden. It was made of small, deliberate acts, each one a rebellion against the emptiness she had been promised. At first, she faced a silence so vast it pressed against her ribs. Meals with the Marquis were measured in silver clinks and curt nods. He spoke to her as one might speak to a steward, confirming schedules, remarking on duties, rarely acknowledging her as more than a legal instrument. Yet Diana, who had nursed her mother with steady hands, knew how to keep her own silence purposeful. She observed. She learned the names of every servant in the house, their children, their grievances. She refused to treat them as shadows. When she thanked a scullery maid by name, words spread like fire in dry grass. Within weeks, she had won what her husband had not. Loyalty that was not bought, but given freely. Her next quiet conquest was knowledge. She studied the ledgers as her father never had, tracing each figure until she could see where waste lived and where fairness could bloom. She asked questions of stewards who were accustomed only to commands. When she discovered that a tenant family's rent had doubled unjustly after a failed harvest, she brought the matter directly to her husband. He dismissed her concern with the cold precision of law, yet 2 weeks later she learned the rent had been reduced. He never admitted her influence, but she saw the shift. He was listening, even as he pretended not to. The true rise began in the neglected garden. It was not merely an overgrown tangle of roses and weeds. It was a grave for his mother's memory, abandoned under his father's decree. Diana walked through the rusted gate and felt the weight of loss embedded in the thorns. She resolved to restore it, not only for beauty, but for survival. It gave her purpose in a house that would otherwise have swallowed her whole. She worked beside the gardeners, her gloves torn, her gowns stained. Servants watched in shock as the new marchioness bent her knees in the soil. To them, it was unthinkable. To Diana, it was liberation. She was not waiting to be loved. She was creating something that could not be denied. At first, her husband mocked her efforts with silence, but often she caught him standing at the edge of the grounds, gaze fixed on the place where white roses struggled to bloom again. One evening, he found her in the conservatory, arranging flowers, and asked why she dirtied her hands with labor unfit for her station. Her answer was simple: because order from chaos is a form of peace. Something flickered in his eyes then, something too swift for her to name, but she knew she had spoken to a wound he carried. The rise was marked not by triumphs, but by fractures in his armor. She found him one night in the library, holding a miniature portrait in moonlight, his face carved with grief. He hid it quickly, but not before she saw tenderness break through his reserve. When she bruised her arm among the rose thorns, he touched her skin with unguarded gentleness, scolding the roses for their cruelty even as he revealed the warmth of his hands. The next morning, she discovered a jar of salve outside her door, wrapped in plain paper. No note, no explanation. But in that small act, the impossible had already begun. He was learning to care against his will. Society soon tested the fragile growth. Lady Caroline arrived, sharp-eyed and venomous, determined to undermine Diana's place. But where Caroline expected a meek bride, she found steel. Diana answered barbed remarks with calm dignity, and when Caroline tried to seize authority in the household, the Marquis himself, to Caroline's fury, sided with his wife. In that defense, spoken before a room of listening ears, Diana rose higher than she had dreamed. For the first time, her husband called Blackwood her household. The rise was not without shadows. Diana sensed the name Catherine, whispered in his fevered sleep, belonged to a ghost she could not yet touch. She saw how the memory of his mother was both balm and torment. She knew that his past was a chain he had not yet broken. But she also knew this: she had turned a mausoleum into a garden, silence into conversation, disdain into reluctant respect. Her ascent was steady, marked not by sudden triumph, but by the slow gathering of light in dark halls. Each evening, when he joined her at the garden bench, recounting memories of roses his mother once cherished, she felt the shift. The man who had once told her she would never be his true wife was now unknowingly becoming her partner in the smallest of ways. The estate, once a prison, had become her stage, and though love had not yet been spoken, something even more powerful had taken root: hope. For Diana, the rise was not about grandeur or titles. It was about the slow, relentless reshaping of a life she had been given in chains. She rose with every hand she clasped in kindness, with every decision she made to heal what others had abandoned. She rose with every thorn she endured in the garden. Every moment she chose courage over bitterness. And though her husband could not yet name it, he was rising too, drawn upward by the woman who refused to bend beneath his decree. The world beyond Blackwood Manor still saw a cold contract, a marriage of convenience. But within its walls, in the quiet spaces between words and silences, something undeniable was unfolding. A wife who was never meant to be true was, step by step, becoming indispensable. The rise was not yet complete, but its direction was clear. From shadows into light, from duty into devotion, from loneliness into the first fragile bloom of love. It began with a letter that looked harmless enough to be mistaken for kindness. The paper was heavy and cream, the hand precise, the seal impressed with a family crest Diana did not recognize. A footman brought it to the morning room, where she was placing a bowl of late dahlias to coax the grey day into admitting a little colour. She turned the letter over twice before breaking the seal, because she had learned that delay, sometimes, was a way to make sure the heart did not run ahead of the mind. She read it once through without stopping, then again more slowly, each line sinking as if weighted. It was courteous in that particular way cruelty often is. A distant cousin of her husband's, informing her that certain circles in town had begun to speculate about the new Marchioness's ambitions, that a certain gentleman from her county, Sir Alistair Wynne, had been seen boasting in a club that he might have been the better match, that there were whispers about the precise arithmetic by which her family's debts had been rehabilitated, and, this last line as cleanly cut as a wire, perhaps it would be best for the dignity of Blackwood if she were more discreet in her attempts to redirect estate policies she could not be expected to understand. She folded the letter with care and placed it beneath the vase, where the dahlias shadowed it like witnesses. She did not know a Sir Alistair Wynne. She did not need to in order to recognize the pattern. A woman who had not begged for a place must be accused of scheming to keep it. She let the first sting pass the way she had learned to let nettle burn subside, by stillness. Then she rose and went to the study her husband kept as a citadel of exactness. He was already at his desk, a stack of papers aligned with a ruler, the morning light arranged across the floor in rectangles. She placed the letter before him without preface, because prefaces had failed them both too often. He read in silence. A man cannot stop being what years have taught him to be in the span of a page, but the muscle in his jaw that jumped when he reached the mention of her ambitions betrayed him. When he looked up, his eyes were wary in the way of someone who has been surprised by hurt too many times to call it by its name. "I will answer this," he said. "It is not your task to weather the fever of gossip." "It is our task," she answered, and the plural was a bridge laid between them so quietly that he noticed it only as he stepped upon it. He inclined his head, not conceding, but not dismissing. It would have been a small thing on another day. On this day, it was the last easy moment they would have for a long while. Rumour is a plant with shallow roots and fast leaves. Lady Caroline watered it as if it were her profession. She returned to the house as if she were arriving to help, her smile carrying 3 different temperatures of pity. She remarked on the brightness of the revived garden as one might remark on a fever's flush, attractive but alarming. She suggested, softly, always softly, that new money had certain colours, and that people talked, and that perhaps the Marchioness would prefer to withdraw from the harvest supper this year and avoid the appearance of parading conquest. Diana, who had never paraded anything except baskets of bread to tenants with winter at their door, heard what was meant to be heard. She thanked Lady Caroline as one thanks a storm for reminding the roof its nails exist. The world of town does not often condescend to bring its poison to the country directly. It prefers to mail it. A second letter arrived, this one in a hand that stole its formality from law. The board of the Canal Company, in which the estate had a controlling interest, regretted to inform the Marquis that irregularities had been suspected in a contract let to a builder who had, coincidentally, made a donation to a charitable fund in the Marchioness's name. It was a thin insinuation hung upon a coincidence that was not a coincidence at all. Diana had persuaded her husband to repair a dangerous lock that threatened the lives of bargemen. The builder, grateful for the work he should have had months earlier, had sent money to the parish fund for widows that she administered. Now, men who had split hairs finer than silk to justify their neglect of safety would slice those same hairs into accusations of impropriety. He paced in the study with the letter in his hand. His usual control rattled in a way that had nothing to do with fear for his reputation, and everything to do with the way an old shame could dress itself in new clothes. He had always believed that love, or anything like it, could not come untangled from loss. Here it was again, testing him by means of the one thing he trusted without question, his integrity. "This will be resolved," he said, and it was a promise to himself as much as to her. "I will go to London." She stood very still, and then she did the most difficult thing a person can do for someone she loves, who has learned to survive by control. She did not try to control him. "Go," she said. "Go swiftly. Go with a letter in my hand." He frowned, but she had already sat at the small table by the window, uncapped the ink, and written to the board a simple account of the events that had led to the repairs, naming names of the men whose hands had been blistered on wet rope, and whose wives had watched the water as if it might return a body. She did not appeal to pity. She appealed to truth's arithmetic. When she had sanded the page and folded it, she added one sentence across the seal in clean script. "If you would undo a woman's quiet work, do not pretend you are protecting men." Then she handed it to him and returned to the dahlias because she needed the dignity of continuing an interrupted hour. He left that afternoon, his valise packed with documents that could restrain lies. She watched from the step as he mounted. The garden behind her smelled of damp earth and last roses. He hesitated, and in that pause she felt a phantom of the boy he had been, standing in the long shadow of a father's grief. "I will write," he said, which for him was an intimacy. The house altered itself around his absence, the way a woman's dress alters when a brooch is removed. The line remains, but the weight shifts. Duties multiplied. Tenants delayed their rent, in the hope that the canal scandal would force a change in policy. The steward, decent but dull, needed decisions he had not been asked to make in years. Diana saw to them, because seeing to things was what she had learned to do instead of weeping. She held the harvest supper anyway, against Lady Caroline's counsel, and stood for an hour with the miller's wife while the woman described the ache that went down both arms and would not let her sleep. She listened to the carpenter's daughter while the girl explained that numbers, if put in clean rows, looked like fences that could keep wolves off the mind. "Then we will put them in clean rows," Diana said, and arranged for the rector to include the girl in lessons that had previously been offered to boys with less hunger for them. London did what London always does when it is offered a chance to chew bone under a silver cloche. It invited him to dinner and called it due process. He dined with men who complimented his judgment while inviting him to apologize for it. He read through thick files of thin accusations and learned the names of the men who hid their spite behind committees. He answered in paragraphs that did not apologize, because he could not bear to be a man who apologized for doing the right thing. But he slept badly and walked from meeting to meeting with a stiffness that had nothing to do with his boots and everything to do with an affliction that had started somewhere under his shoulder blade and radiated outward as if a cold hand pressed there whenever he remembered the garden. He bought a small jar of salve from a chemist and did not tell himself it was because he missed her. Gossip prefers company. It found an ally in a more solid enemy, the markets. A sudden downturn, born of speculation far away and weather nearer by, strained the cash flow of estates that had bet on smooth seasons. Blackwood was better managed than most, but even good management has to breathe. If you put a hand over its mouth long enough, its vision blurs. Bills that were routine became negotiations. Men who had shaken his hand gladly in spring stood with their hands in their pockets in autumn. He returned to the club where Sir Alistair Wynne was said to boast, and discovered that the man existed after all, a handsome creature with the kind of smile that is always looking for a mirror. Wynne lifted his glass across the room in the old way men signal recognition, without respect. The Marquis ignored him and went to the writing-room, where he wrote to his wife about the board, the markets, and a small incident at a dinner where a man with the sort of appetite that makes crumbs of reputations had offered an ugly joke about charity. He did not write about the ache under his shoulder blade, because in his arithmetic, pain unadmitted could be conquered. Caroline seized the interlude to rearrange the house to suit herself. She did it subtly. A portrait shifted, a seating plan altered, a certain maid reassigned to a less visible post. She made of Blackwood the kind of place she could govern. It was almost a kindness. She had never understood that rule which is not acknowledged as rule, curdles, sour, and poisons the milk. Diana noticed all of it, and chose her ground with more care than a general. She did not fight over chairs, she fought over hours. She moved the relief of the poor to earlier in the week, so that the women did not have to cross the green in the worst of the weather. She moved the music to later in the evening, when the men had drunk enough to sing. People will forgive you almost anything if you give them their song back. Downfall does not arrive as a single catastrophe unless it is a shipwreck. In houses like theirs, it arrives as a sequence of inconveniences dressed as trials, until, suddenly, you realize the room is filling with water. The first gush came from the sluice gate on the upper meadow that cracked in a hard frost and let loose a rush that undermined the bank. 2 cottages were flooded to the waist overnight. The shepherd's wife stood in her yard, her skirts heavy with river, and laughed because she had no other weapon to lift. Diana went there before breakfast, barefoot under her riding skirt, because she had learned that boots filled with water hold a cold that does not let go. She organized the move to the schoolhouse, and in the middle of giving orders realized her hands were shaking. She realized also, with something like shame and then like a lesson, that her husband's severity had sometimes protected her from the clatter of catastrophe. She wrote to him that night with the bluntness emergencies teach. "We need funds urgently to repair the bank, or we will lose the meadow this winter and the lambs next spring. I am not asking for dignity. I am asking for the sheep." London was not kind to letters written in the language of mud. He answered as swiftly as his schedule allowed, with a draft drawn from a line of credit that would have been unnecessary a month earlier, and now felt like an admission that life is a tide and not a ledger. He enclosed a note, not businesslike, not indifferent, that said simply, "I trust your judgment. Use what you must." He sealed it before he could add another sentence that might have made it warmth. On the way back to his rooms, the ache under his shoulder blade became a cough he could not fully suppress. He told himself the air of the Thames had always been bad in autumn. Sir Alistair Wynne made his move where such men always do, in a crowd. He arranged to be introduced to the Marquis at a reception, spoke of the canal in the tone men reserve for an argument they think they have already won, and then, with an ease that might have passed for charm in a room less practised at cruelty, expressed a hope that Lady Diana, "Forgive me, Lady Russell, ah yes, now Marchioness, of course," was finding the change to her station comfortable. "Some women," he said, require a season or two to learn the art of restraint. There were men present who pretended to misunderstand him. There were also men who did not. The Marquis's reply was so even it sang. He said that some men never learn the art of courage, that restraint is an adornment of people who can afford to be careless with themselves, and that men who speak of women as if they were furniture forget that furniture outlasts houses. The room nibbled at this and found it a little too bracing to enjoy. Wynne laughed in that way that says we are all still friends, and the Marquis saw in him the kind of emptiness that spreads like mould. At home, the days narrowed. Caroline found a letter in Diana's hand to the rector arranging a support for the wives of the canal labourers, and carried it, as if by accident, into the room where the older members of the family gathered for tea. She spoke of it as if it were a matter of arithmetic, and in 5 minutes had attached to it words like patronage and preference that dripped suggestive poison. The old aunt sniffed. The younger cousin frowned and said it was good to be charitable, but better to be circumspect. Diana let them speak because she had chosen, long before, to pick fights where they mattered, and this one would not be settled with porcelain cups. But when she went to her room that night and laid her hairbrush on the dressing table, she realized her hand was shaking again. She put her palm flat on the wood and pressed until the tremor subsided, the way a person might press on a door to feel if the fire was on the other side. He returned from London looking thinner than a ledger line. The canal matter had been cleared not by the board's integrity, there is never enough of that to rely upon, but by the quiet intervention of a barge master who surprised himself by speaking in a room where his boots looked wrong. He told a story of a night that would have ended in drowning if the gate had not been repaired. Men who had listened to the sound of money their whole lives instead heard, for once, the sound of water eating a bank. They backed away from accusation with the grace cowards have perfected. They congratulated themselves on their fairness and called it justice. He came home assuming a measure of peace he had not earned. Peace does not forgive assumption. Within hours of his arrival, a messenger brought another kind of news, the kind that looks like smoke because it has yet to flame. A small fire at a warehouse on the wharf, where estate wool was stored, contained, swiftly extinguished, but requiring attention to secure compensation and reassurance from insurers whose business is doubt. He turned around that same evening, saying that 3 days would suffice. Diana nodded and did not say what trembled inside her. Stay. In the interstice between his departures and returns, the house learned to sound different. There are noises that people who love each other make that the walls learn to miss. There are also absences that become a sound. She moved through rooms that hummed with the old behavior of a family that had taught itself to live without tenderness. She held the center, because if she let go, there would be no center for anyone else. When the servants saw the depth of her exhaustion, they hid their concern, as people do when they are afraid their care will be received as insolence. Martha, who had followed her from the old house into this one like an oath, came at night to rub her hands with oil and scold her into sleep. "Close your eyes," Martha said, "or they will set on your face like stones." The downfall found its first true expression not in a scandal, not in an account, but in a winter wind that arrived as if summoned by all their refusals. It came sweeping down the valley with the malice of altitude. Trees strained. The river threw itself against its banks. The schoolhouse roof began to lift at a corner, and then lay down again with a noise that sounded like a giant deciding to stand up. Diana stood at the window of the morning room and saw the sky make itself into a kind of sheet and the land curl beneath it. She gathered the household in the hall, spoke calmly, assigned tasks, shutters to be checked, candles trimmed, hearths banked low to avoid smoke. You cannot reason with a storm, but you can keep people from panicking at its grammar. At the worst of it, a shout went up from the stable. The old mare in the far stall had thrown herself against the door in fear. The groom had been struck by the bolt and lay in the straw with a bleeding scalp. Diana went out into the gale with Martha and the undergroom, and together they worked the mare's door loose without letting the wind carry it into the yard. She wrapped the groom's head with her scarf, her fingers stiff with cold, whispering the same nonsense to the animal she had whispered to her mother in fever. There, here, stay, stay. When at last they had the mare in the inner stall and the man on a pallet by the stove, she looked up to find Lady Caroline standing at the threshold, her face set not in cruelty, but in a bewilderment that was, perhaps, more dangerous. "This is not your place," Caroline said. "I would not have us all spoken of as—" And here she could not find the word that would not condemn herself. "As odd." "This is my place," Diana said, not with heat, but with something rarer, certainty. "It is a place that moves. Today it is here." The wind dropped like a sulking child. The river held. The roof remained. The stable smelled of fear and hay and iron. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed without taking off her wet skirt. For a long minute she did not move. When Martha entered to scold her into dry clothes, she found her mistress looking at her hands as if they belonged to someone who had not quite arrived. He came back from the wharf 3 days later with a cough that would not be argued with and a face wrapped too tightly over cheekbones. The warehouse had been poorly built, the fire started by negligence, the insurer a man born for the exact kind of conversation he had had to conduct. All insinuation, no conclusion. He brought back a guarantee that would cover the loss if, and only if, 3 different forms were filed in duplicate and signed by men too important to hold pens. It was a victory only if you counted by the penny and not by the breath. He tried to smile when she came to greet him, and felt the attempt claw at his throat. She reached for his hand and felt the heat in his skin that was not the heat of the fire he had stood beside. He extracted his hand carefully, as if refusing help were a matter of courtesy. "It is nothing," he said. "It is the river air." She did not contradict him because she had learned that contradiction is a poor medicine for a man who has been sick with pride for years. She said instead that soup was hot in the dining room, and that she had kept a portion of the harvest pudding he liked, though he would never say so. He sat at the table as if it were a trial, and then ate as if it were a duty, and then, suddenly, could not continue. He put the spoon down with a very small sound and closed his eyes. She did not place her hand on his temple. She did not call the physician yet. She told Martha to bank the fire higher, and for the first time since her wedding day, she allowed herself to forget who was watching. "You must rest," she said. "You must let someone else watch the river tonight. Downfall is sometimes a series of refusals to surrender until the body does the surrendering." He insisted on reading the correspondence in his study and managed 20 minutes before the words went to water and the water to a room without doors. He coughed until he tasted metal. He stood and saw, just briefly, the shadow on the carpet curve like an arbor, and felt a bench under him that was not there. He shook his head in the old soldier's way men do when they think a march can defeat a fever. He walked to the window to ask the air for permission to be well. The air did not answer. When he turned back, she was in the doorway with a glass. "Will you let me?" she asked, and he nodded, not because the nod was easy, but because it was precisely the hardest thing he could do. His illness announced itself fully that night, as if, having been asked twice to come in, it were offended by delay. The fever rose like a tide that thinks the moon is foolish. The cough loosened a rattle in his chest that alarmed the physician and frightened no one more than it frightened the man himself when he was lucid enough to notice it. He dreamed himself younger and woke older. He said a name in his sleep that was not hers, and then, later, said hers without the armor of title. She sat beside him with a basin and a cloth, and the patience she had first learned at a bed where a woman's breath came hard. She counted axe strokes in her mind to measure the hours, because clocks are too honest in sick rooms. Lady Caroline did not enter the room. She presided from the corridor with the authority of those who believe white linen and social distance are the same thing as virtue. She told people what they must not do. She reminded servants not to bring scandal on the house by talking of the master's illness as if he were mortal. She ordered flowers removed because their scent offended her, which was the first kindness she had performed in years, though she did not know it. Martha moved between bedchamber and still-room, brewing, fetching, commanding, her loyalty to the woman she had nursed when she was a girl expanding itself to include a man she did not like, because people we love often ask us to love people we do not. There is a particular cruelty in illness that arrives on the heels of vindication. He had done what was just with the canal. He had endured the small humiliations of men too cowardly to say what they meant. He had returned to find that the old life would not accept him on those terms. Dark things in him made their case with the authority of history. You are being punished for believing in repair. You are being punished for trusting anyone but yourself. He resisted them, fought them, argued with them, and finally, exhausted, put his hand out and found her hand there, and did not let go, because letting go would have been a confession. At the worst of the fever, he saw a garden so bright it pained him, and in it a woman bent among white roses. He believed it was his mother, and tried to run toward her, but his legs, which had always obeyed him, refused. The woman looked up, and the face was not the face of his childhood, and the shock of that, relief, grief, woke him with a cry he would have preferred to swallow. She was there, cloth in hand, eyes clear. He wanted to apologize for the cry, for the years, for the sentence he had spoken at their first meeting, as if he were describing the weather and not altering a climate. He managed only a whisper that was not yet an apology, but had the shape of one. "Do not go," he said, the plea of a boy, and she, who had been told to go or stay by people all her life, chose again to stay. Outside the sick room, the world did not hold its breath. The river receded. The shepherd's wife laughed again for a different reason. The steward made a good decision, and then came creeping to the door to tell it like a child showing his mother a drawing. Martha slept, leaning against a chair for an hour, and woke with a start, and scolded herself for sleeping in the presence of need. Lady Caroline wrote to a friend that she had always predicted the new Marchioness would not withstand the pressures of a great house, then crossed out the sentence because it did not sound like care. Sir Alistair Wynne told someone at the club that Blackwood's bones were good but the new tissue untested, a remark so revolting in its metaphor that even the man who repeated it later to a third party felt for an instant ashamed. In a small cottage 3 miles away, a child knelt beside her bed and prayed that the master would live, because the Marchioness had shown her how to add. The physician told Diana quietly, in the antechamber that smelled of camphor and the doctor's tiredness, that the next 2 days would decide the thing. He said it in the voice men use when they do not wish to admit they are messengers, not judges. She bowed her head, not to him, but to the news, and went back in. She did not ask for permission to do what she had already decided. That the room would stay warm, but not hot. That the linens would be changed more often than custom allowed. That no one would speak in whispers, because whispered fear is an infection of its own. She unbuttoned the top of his nightshirt when his breath grew shallow, and did not care who saw her do it. She set aside the porcelain bowl and took up a rougher cloth when the fine one failed to draw the heat. At dawn, when the light is ungenerous, she moved the chair to the other side of the bed, because men's eyes sometimes find their way to light, even when their minds do not. He opened his and saw her not as a symbol of a bargain, but as a body between him and a cliff. He closed them again because the effort broke something in him that needed to break. Downfall had done its work well. It had stripped him of pretense, quieted his instincts that had served as both his armor and his prison, and put him in a position no mastery could answer. It had also revealed, by the light of fever and the patience of a woman, a possibility he had spent years refusing, that strength exposed to tenderness is not extinguished but transformed. He slept then, not the restless doze of a man negotiating with himself, but the blunt, honest sleep of someone who has handed the keys of his house to another and asked her to keep it standing. She sat and watched and learned the hours of his breath the way a musician learns the bar, where the melody goes under and then comes back up. When he woke at noon the day after, the fever had not gone, but it had fallen from its height. He drank the broth she gave him without arguing with it. He put his hand out again, and this time when it found hers, it did not seek assurance so much as offer it. There are many who would call this the beginning of the climb. They would be wrong. It was the last necessary descent, the dark side in him teaching him the edge of his own cliff, the downfall removing the props that had made of his life a stage where the play could be performed forever, without anyone saying the name of the thing being performed. The storm had done less damage than the years of deliberate weather he had summoned around himself. His body had been the only messenger he would receive. It had come to tell him, in the oldest script, that the garden he had locked against himself could not be reopened by decree. It could be reopened only by opening his eyes and admitting that someone else had the key and that she had carried it patiently through rumor and frost and flood, without asking for the title to the house, only the right to keep it warm. She did not know what the next hours would demand. She only knew what the last ones had taught her, that falling is not always the opposite of rising, that sometimes the floor at the bottom of the fall is the first honest place either of them had stood. She wiped his forehead again and said his name aloud, because names, spoken clearly, are ropes. In the corridor, Martha scolded a footman for breathing too loudly, and then, catching her own harshness as one catches a plate before it hits the floor, patted his arm. Lady Caroline sat on a chair and wrote a letter that sounded like a prayer and was not one, and then, for the first time in a long time, put the letter away and said nothing to anyone. The house listened. The roses, battered by the storm, held their petals like a promise they were tired of making, but would make anyway. The room smelled of linen and broth and a little of fear. She did not look away. The fever did not break in a single night, but when it ebbed, it left him emptied, as if his body had been scraped down to the soul. For days he hovered between muttered dreams and sharp lucidity, and in each return to waking he seemed startled to find her still beside him. He had been trained by life to expect abandonment, to believe that loss was the only ending promised to men like him. Yet she stayed. She stayed when the hours bled into each other, when the stench of sweat and sickness clung to the linens, when servants whispered that the master might not see spring. She stayed until he no longer questioned her presence, until his hand sought hers in the dark without hesitation, until the sight of her face at dawn became proof that he had not yet been claimed by the shadows. It was in those fragile hours that the words long withheld began to stumble from him. Sometimes he spoke of his mother, of roses white as milk, and the sound of her laughter carried on summer air. Other times, half delirious, he confessed what he had never said aloud, that his father's grief had turned into blame, that the boy he once was believed himself guilty of a death he could not prevent. At times, he spoke a woman's name, Catherine, softly, with a mixture of longing and despair. Diana, sitting with her basin and cloth, felt the sharp pang of jealousy pierce her chest, yet she did not flinch. She understood that ghosts must be allowed to pass through before the living can be seen. The climax of their ordeal arrived on a night when even the physician despaired. His breathing had grown shallow, each inhale a battle, each exhale a surrender. The doctor whispered to her in the corridor that the Marquis might not survive till morning, that she should prepare herself. She returned to the chamber, closed the door firmly, and sat by his side with a steadiness that belied the storm inside her. He opened his eyes, hollow, fever-bright, and for a long moment stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Then, with a voice rasping like dry leaves, he whispered, "Forgive me. I was wrong. You are my true wife." The words struck her harder than any decree or insult ever had. She took his hand, hot and trembling, and pressed it against her lips. "Then live," she answered, fierce as prayer. "Live to prove it." For the first time, he did not resist the command of another. He closed his eyes, and whether it was her voice or his own will that held him, his breath steadied, deepened, refused to cease. From that night, the fever broke, slowly but undeniably. Recovery was not swift, but it was sure. And as strength returned to his limbs, something softer returned to his soul. He no longer spoke with the iron formality that had once been his armor. He began to ask her thoughts before decisions, to linger in her company beyond the demands of duty, to share silence with her as if silence itself were a conversation. The garden, once abandoned, became their meeting place. He walked there on unsteady legs, leaning on her arm, and when he saw the roses bloom again, he wept without shame. Yet tragedy leaves its mark, even when it does not kill. The man who rose from that sickbed was changed forever. He had confronted his deepest fear, that love would always abandon him, that he was destined to stand alone, and found it defeated not by triumph or strength, but by the quiet endurance of a woman who refused to leave. The illness had nearly claimed his life, but in doing so it had stripped away his pride, his suspicion, his loneliness. In that stripping, something new was born. The possibility of love unchained from fear. The household, once a place of cold distance, felt the shift. Servants whispered that the Marquis smiled more often, that his voice, though still stern, carried warmth. Lady Caroline, thwarted in her schemes, found her influence withering like weeds starved of sun. For the first time, Blackwood Manor felt like a home rather than a fortress. The climax of their story was not the fever alone, but the moment it forced, a choice between death with walls intact or life with walls broken. He chose life, and in choosing it, he chose her. Diana, who had entered the house resigned to a loveless marriage, now found herself holding not just a husband's hand, but a partner's heart. And though the road ahead would not be free of trials, both knew that something irrevocable had happened in that chamber, the death of pride and the birth of love. Years later, when people spoke of the change at Blackwood, they never mentioned the fever first. They spoke of the roses. Strangers noticed them from the road and slowed their horses to look, as if the garden had learned to speak and was telling a secret in colour. The beds that had once withered under neglect now curved in quiet abundance, whites like milk, blushes like the first thought of dawn, deeper shades that suggested the courage to be seen. Children ran along the paths without being told they were too noisy for a house so grand. Old men asked to sit on the bench beneath the arbour and closed their eyes as if listening to a hymn they had known in youth. Those who remembered the older Blackwood, the one ruled by exactness and absence, found themselves disoriented by the sight of joy, and then slowly soothed by it, as if their bones could at last admit a warmth the air had always refused them. Change is rarely a proclamation. It is a series of decisions whose echoes become a climate. He began with the smallest acts, the ones no herald would announce. He shifted his desk to the window so that he could see the garden while he worked. He asked the steward to bring him not only numbers but names when they discussed repairs. He insisted that the tenants be told not merely what was required but why, because obedience without dignity breeds resentment, and resentment is a rot that hides in good wood. He learned to set aside the cruel economy of pride for the generous arithmetic of trust. It cost him in small ways that scandalized no one but himself. Minutes surrendered to listening, letters rewritten with fewer sharp angles, apologies made before they were demanded. Each cost bought a return he had not known to expect. Ease at table, laughter that did not ask permission, the discovery that a day need not be braced like a brace across a break. Diana did not transform into a different creature because love found its voice. She became more fully the woman she had practiced being in hunger and in duty. She kept the parish fund for widows and broadened it into a circle that included deserted wives and orphaned apprentices. And when the rector murmured about precedent, she handed him a list of names and said that mercy is the only precedent worth defending. She continued to walk the fields at dawn with her skirt pinned up and her boots muddy, not because she wished to perform humility, but because she could not bear to rule a place she did not know. She sat with the miller's wife until the ache in the woman's arms learned to lessen. She practiced sums with the carpenter's daughter until the girl's fences became bridges. She insisted on music one evening a week and told the old fiddler he was to be paid as a professional, because beauty done well is labor, and labor deserves coin. When she moved through the house, servants who had taught themselves to become invisible stepped into visibility as if answering their names at last. There were ceremonies too, because a house like Blackwood needs rituals as surely as a garden needs water. On the first anniversary of his illness's breaking, they opened the garden to the village. No one was required to bow. The children from the schoolhouse sang a simple song, and the boy with the twisted foot, whose cobbler had been paid from a line in a ledger Diana wrote as if it were a promise, was lifted to hang a garland on the arbour. The Marquis made no speech. He rested his hand briefly on the bench where he had, once, dreamed himself helpless, and then he held out that hand to his wife, and the gesture said the only speech that mattered: "I am here because you are." People spoke of that day for months afterward, not because of grandeur, but because of clarity. They said they had seen something break and mend at once, and that the mending was stronger than the original wood. Lady Caroline did not disappear. The world is rarely so tidy. She lingered in rooms where influence had once come to her like a dog to a whistle. But influence, when starved of purpose, thins. Diana gave her duties she could not twist: organizing blankets for winter, overseeing the seamstress's wages, delivering baskets to the infirm with the physician in attendance so that gossip had no time to flower. Caroline discovered, to her own surprise, that usefulness is a narcotic that steals the appetite for poison. She did not become kind exactly, but she became less dangerous, which is a form of kindness the selfish can achieve when guided into work. Sir Alistair Wynne met his legacy sooner. He tried once more, at a race meeting, to press a slight upon the Marchioness's character into the ear of a man he owed money. The man, possessing neither patience nor cleverness, repeated it within earshot of a barge-master from the canal. The barge-master, reminded of a night when a repaired gate had kept him from a river grave, asked the repeater whether he preferred his gossip or his teeth. The choice was made hastily in favour of dentistry. Wynne learned that nothing against her stuck, not because the world had improved, but because she had quietly made too many people's lives heavier with bread and lighter with worry. Slanders cannot find purchase on a house whose doors are open to the hungry. He faded into the polite nothing that awaits men whose best talent is the repetition of other men's vices. With health came a tenderness in him that startled no one more than himself. He learned his wife's rhythms the way he had once learned exchange rates, except that curves of breath resist the tyranny of numbers. He learned when to interrupt and when to let the silence hold, when to send a note ahead of a hard conversation so the shock would not be cruel, when to stand behind her and when to walk at her side. He found that her steadiness did not rebuke his strength, but completed it, as the arbour completes the bench by turning shade into shelter. There were failures, days when old iron returned to his voice, nights when self-disgust made him curt. But contrition arrived faster now, and contrition is a craftsman that mends cracks before they widen. They wrote a new sentence together to replace the one that had begun their marriage like a curse. It was not spoken over a crowd or engraved in a cornerstone. It was spoken in the garden one evening when bees were drunk on late blossoms and the sky was learning how to darken without grieving. He faced her with the awkward courage of a man who has learned to be brave in battle and is now learning to be brave in love. "I said once," he told her, "that you would never be my true wife. The truth is that I did not know how to be a true husband. If you can bear it, I would like to spend the rest of my life learning that with you." She answered the way she always answered what mattered, simply, "Then we will learn." It was not a vow that pretended to banish sorrow or shield them from weather. It was an agreement to be wet together when it rained and warm together when the house held heat. Children came because life is stubborn. Their first, a daughter, arrived with a cry like a pinprick of lightning, fierce and bright. He held her as if instructed by a memory of being blessed. his mother's hand on his head, and discovered that blessing can also descend from a weight of 8 pounds. Their second, a son, arrived in the season when roses lean heavy. Diana slept with her hand on his chest, as if the touch tied him to the world. The nursery became a country with its own laws. He, who once found noise an offence, learned to measure the health of a household by the variety of its sounds at dawn: spatters of milk, nursery rhymes off-key, a laugh from the kitchen that began in a pan and ended in a throat. In that racket, he felt his father's clenched instruction finally release its grip. He would rule this house by welcome, not by fear. Legacy, they discovered, is a thing both smaller and larger than reputation. It is smaller because it is built out of mournings and receipts, the way a house is built from mortar as much as from stone. It is larger because people who will never know your name feel its weather. The tenants' cottages no longer leaked in a hard rain. The schoolhouse added a shelf of books that did not belong to the rector alone. The canal kept its gates sound through winters that took pride in breaking weak things. The Widows' Fund showed its accounts once a year in the churchyard after services, so that anyone who doubted could read and then decide to doubt or to believe with information, not rumour. Men who had learned to keep their hats on in defiance began to remove them on entering the hall, because respect, when it is no longer demanded, grows in the body like an instinct. He wrote letters to the board now and then, advocating for safety in words that were firmer than courtesy, but less cruel than he once enjoyed being. He learned the difference between a rebuke and a correction. He learned that a man can preserve his integrity without polishing it into a mirror that reflects only himself. When he sat at the end of a long day with a glass he didn't need and a view he had once ignored, he sometimes thought of the boy who hadn't been allowed to grieve as a boy. He did not excuse the men who had formed him, but he forgave the child who had complied. The forgiveness did not absolve him of duty. It armed him for it. She, for her part, refused to become an emblem. People tried to make her one, the story of the poor noble girl who saved a house with roses and patience and good sense. But she resisted the simplification the way a rose resists being pressed into a page. She age-spotted, and the spots made a map of the work she had done in the sun. She wore a small scar on her wrist from a thorn she had not avoided quickly enough in the early days of the garden. When young wives came to her in the morning room with fears wrapped in politeness, she did not tell them stories of miracles. She spoke of ledgers and of listening, of insisting on a seat at the table where money is discussed, of the necessity of rest. She taught them to say, "I will answer that tomorrow," and to mean it. She taught them that love without sleep becomes martyrdom, and martyrdom is a poor foundation for a home. Once, years after Caroline had found the dignity of quiet, the cousin brought her grown daughter to call. The young woman, no longer a child asked to make less sound than a clock, watched the children at the edge of the lawn and said, without calculation, "It is a relief to be in a house that is not afraid of itself." Diana smiled, because the words were a bearing taken, a chart made. Houses can teach fear so silently that their inhabitants do not know they have learned it until they are standing in a different climate and their lungs expand. She walked the girl through the kitchen, let her taste a sauce, asked her what she wanted from a life that did not belong to others. The girl did not know yet. Few do. But she left with colour in her face that was not from cosmetics. Sorrow did not leave them untouched. There was a winter when the boy fell ill with a throat that tightened and refused to loosen. The doctor came and said little, because little could be said. They sat on either side of the bed and did the work of fearing together rather than separately. The boy recovered with a cough that lingered into spring and a voice that turned husky at night, reminding them both that victory is often a reprieve. Another year, the river rose higher than anyone remembered and took a lamb and a plank and the corner of a field with it. They rebuilt the bank with help from men who did not wait to be hired because they had already been helped in seasons prior. That is one definition of legacy. A debt repaid by people you did not ask to pay you back. When their daughter married a man who liked to read aloud by the fire, they gave her the brooch that had warmed under Diana's dress the day she walked toward a sentence that had since been replaced. "This is not for display," Diana told her. "It is for remembering." The young woman asked what she should remember, and he, who had once mistaken control for safety, answered before his wife could. "That houses can be kept warm," he said, "but not by shutting windows." The daughter laughed and kissed them both, and grew into a woman who wrote letters with ink that did not smear, because she had, from childhood, seen her mother blot words with care. As for the past, the ghosts did not become saints. They became quiet. He visited the garden on a morning that smelled of rain, and sat on the bench alone and said his mother's name out loud. It did not hurt the way it had. It was a taste, like the first strawberry, sharp and sweet in one bite. He said Catherine's name, too, in a tone that was neither plea nor apology. He did not summon them again after that day. A man who has learned to tell the truth to himself does not need to rehearse his wounding to prove he was wounded. He carried the memory like a seal on a document already read and filed. In the end, as people love to say, as if endings were neat, there was not a single deed that defined them. There was a garden that outlasted arguments, a school shelf that outlasted a rector, a canal gate that outlasted a storm, a house whose doors remembered the feel of being opened by a woman who had once been told she would be tolerated but never loved. There were words that had once bruised and were now replaced by gentler words that did not erase the bruise so much as teach the skin to live with it without flinching. If you asked him, in the final measure of his life, what he most regretted, he would not mention the fever or the losses that had preceded it. He would say that he wasted time arranging furniture in rooms he refused to enter. If you asked him what he cherished most, he would say that time became generous at last, because he stopped hoarding it from the people it was meant to hold. If you asked her, she would not speak of triumph. She would say that she was grateful to have been present when presence was needed, and that the rest was embroidery, lovely, but not to be confused with cloth. On a late summer evening, long after the first roses of their reconciled life had bloomed and been pruned and bloomed again, they walked the garden as they always did, slowly, as if refusing to outpace the day. He leaned a little on his stick, more out of prudence than necessity. She paused by a rose new to the bed, one with petals that seemed to hold dusk within them. "Do you see it?" she asked. He did. It looked like a lesson. That darkness, held rightly, gives depth to light. He laughed. Not at the cleverness of the thought, but at the mercy of it. They sat on the bench. The children's voices came faintly from the far lawn, and the kitchen sent up its steady clang of evening preparation, and the stables breathed hay and animal comfort. The world, which had once felt like an adversary to be out-argued, now felt like an ally to be greeted. He took her hand. Once he would have believed that the gesture obligated him to a speech. Now it was the speech. He said her name quietly, because names, even after decades, are bridges. She answered with his, and for a while they said nothing else. Legacy in that moment was not the garden or the ledger or the song nights or the laughter that ran through servants' corridors. Legacy was a bench holding two people who had learned, the long way and the hard way, that love is not a sentence pronounced at an altar or a letter posted to a board. It is a practice, daily, stubborn, tender, exacting, the kind that transforms a fate into a home. When the first star pricked through the deepening blue, he thought of the boy counting rules at a table with iron handwriting and of the girl counting spoons in a house afraid of winter. He wanted to tell them that the future had not ignored them. It had taken their carefulness and turned it into shelter for others. It had taken their loneliness and turned it into room. It had taken their pride and softened it into patience. He squeezed her hand once, a signal learned in sickness and retained in health. She returned it, the same pressure, the same promise. The roses breathed out their faint evening scent, as if recalling without sorrow all the seasons they had endured. The house behind them, no longer a fortress, not yet a ruin, simply a place where lives had been lived with effort and with grace, held its breath and then let it go, the way homes do when the people inside them have finally learned how to stay.